Hello. Hope everyone's doing well.
Hi, how you going?
I'm doing quite well. I have just received the last official tick for my PhD. It was just one little admin really thing, but just got the final admin ticked off.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
mate,
fantastic.
congratulations.
Yes.
Oh, so you just finished it now?
Yes. Well, I
Oh,
finished it last year. Finished it last year, but it's taken this long for them to finish all of the administration stuff on it, honestly. It's been quite a wait.
wow. Oh,
Yeah.
that must feel good. That's great.
Yeah, it's done now.
How long did it take you?
It's been 5 years since I started
Wow.
now. Yeah, quite a
Golly.
quite a while.
Would you do it again?
I
No, don't
wouldn't.
answer
I
that.
wouldn't. It's once is enough. Once is enough. I mean, I still want to do research, so still gonna be doing
Yes.
similar things.
Wow. What did you do it on, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, we got a few minutes before we started. I did my PhD on using artificial intelligence, convolutional neural networks, on satellite images in order to detect broad plant growth properties
Hmm.
for crop breeding. So if they have a big field with a bunch of small plots of wheat or canola or something like that, and they're trying to assess, does this cultivar grow better than that cultivar? And they're like 1 meter by 1 meter big. Can we detect how well those are growing throughout the season using satellite imagery? And the answer is currently no, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I've shown uh, experiments that are a bit promising, and I've shown how we can improve it and potentially get to the future where we will be able to do that.
Interesting. Oh, 5 years.
Okay. Yeah, through COVID as well.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So how many papers have you written?
Um, Two during the PhD. Previously, I've written a couple of others. Um, well, and some extra ones here and there. There was a third one that wasn't related to my PhD that I did as well.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so I have a couple of papers under my belt. Uh, right. So I'm gonna wait 2 more minutes for the 5 minutes past because that's Latrobe. That's how we do it face to face. That's how I'm gonna do it here before I do the official um, introduction. And just wanted to make sure I've got everything ready. Yeah, cool. Mm. All right. Let me start sharing my screen. Make sure. All right. Just want to double check. Can everyone see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yep.
Is there anything at the top? Anything in the way?
Yeah.
No? I'm going to assume not. I think it hasn't been in the past. Okay. Well, uh, thanks everyone for coming along. This is module 3. We're going to be doing lectures 5 and 6. Um, in last week's lectures, we started looking at the sort of ground up of what is machine learning? What does it mean to train a model so that a computer can do a task that it couldn't do before. We looked at a sort of spatial representation of very simple data in the labs. We looked at simple models like linear regression. And in the lab, you should have spent a little bit of time looking at multi-layer perceptrons, which are the simplest form of neural network. We mostly looked, or we pretty much entirely looked at tabular data last week. We looked at how to use a row of a table and put that into a model and then have it make a prediction. And then in lecture 4, which is module 2, second lecture of module 2, we looked at how to evaluate those models, especially around classification. This week's lecture, we're going to be talking about computer vision. Actually, I'm going to try something. Uh, Um, do tools, laser pointer. All right, so last time I tried the laser pointer, there were some problems. Can I just double check with you? Is the laser pointer causing any problems with the screen share, or is it, can I use the laser pointer?
Seems to be all right for me, I think.
Seems to be okay. Well, unless somebody says there's a problem, I'm gonna keep using the laser pointer. All right. So this week's lecture, we're going to be talking about computer vision. Well, first lecture, we're going to be talking about computer vision in particular. We're going to be talking about the basic ideas, the basic, how should I say it, the basic tasks of computer vision. That is the classification, detection, and segmentation computer vision tasks. We're going to be talking at a pretty high level, and then next lecture, lecture 6, which will be today as well, we're going to be talking in a little bit more detail about how we get there. For now, we just want to understand the end point. We have a model that can do a thing. What is the thing that the model can do exactly? So, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about visual features, the base way that models work, the base way that computer vision models in particular work. Then we're going to be talking about the computer vision tasks. And then because we talked about it in the lab, and because it comes up often in computer vision tasks, we're going to be extending the classification metrics from binary classification to multi-class classification. And like I said, you had a bit of experience with that in the lab already. So first up is visual features. Before we, oh, hold on. Got to make sure we tick off all our boxes. By the end of this module, this lecture in particular, we want to make sure that you know what visual features are and how they are used in computer vision models at a high level. You don't need to describe them in mathematical terms or anything. We want you to be able to talk about feature representations and how those relate to the visual features, feature representations, how those appear inside of a model. And then we want to make sure that you know the difference between the computer vision tasks, image classification, object detection, and the two different kinds of segmentation, including what does their output look like and what can you do with them. And the last thing we want you to be aware of in lecture 5 is the idea of pre-trained models and uh, where they come from, how do you get them, what do you do with them? Okay, so starting with visual features. Let's start with a really sort of maybe dumb question, which if you've read the module notes, you'll be familiar with this question. Um, what do you see? You don't need to shout it out. I think we all know what it is, but the question isn't just what do you see, but how do you know that that is what you see? Keep that in mind. Think about it for a second. How do you know that what you see is a dog? Obviously, it's a dog. And then consider the same thing for this image. Well, firstly, is it a dog? Looks to be a dog. Has all the things that we associate with a dog. And then let's have a look at this last image as well. Just be aware that these last two images are AI generated. These are not real animals. And this last one, is it a dog or is it a cat? And this one might be a little more difficult. I think most people, at least myself, I would say this still looks like a dog, but it has some kind of features of a cat. So it kind of, as Alexis says, it kind of looks a bit like a fox, right? Foxes have some mixture of features. But then how do we know that? Well, I'm just going to list a few things that I see that make me question whether it's a dog. And that's a shorter snout than I would expect for a dog, longer whiskers than I'd expect for a dog. Something about the paws that look more like a cat to me than a dog. And even the tail is a bit cat looking to me. The ear shape a little bit. Maybe there's some dogs that have ear shapes like that, but the exact arrangement of fur in there just really looks like a cat to me. But overall, it still looks like a dog. So what I'm doing there, and what hopefully you're doing as well when you think about this, is you're sort of breaking up the image into identifiable pieces. And that's a good point from H. The nose doesn't look like a cat because it's got the big black nose that is more for dogs. So it does look like a dog. We're breaking up the image into these like identifiable pieces. I pointed to the whiskers. I pointed to the ears. I pointed to the paws. I pointed to the tail. These are like pieces of the image which I am using in order to understand the image. So if we want to talk about how a computer understands images or how we want a computer to understand images, we typically we want to start from how do humans recognize things in image? How do they understand what are in images? And as I said, when I'm looking at that, I would say that what I'm doing is looking for many visual features to identify that it's a dog. It's that long snout with a big black nose. It's the exact shape of the eye and ears. Maybe I can't define exactly what it is, but I'm looking for what that looks like. And the kind of fur that's there has to look right. It has to be furry, right? If it was something else, not furry, then it probably wouldn't be a dog. Even just like the number of legs, the body shape. It's got a head and then four legs and shape like that. These are the kinds of things that I'm looking for. And if we want a computer vision algorithm to identify objects, we kind of want them to be able to do the same thing, right? We want them to be able to identify pieces and compose those pieces into a final prediction. One piece of this puzzle that's pretty interesting is that we don't need to see every piece of a dog to know that it's a dog, right? If we had a very big close-up of a dog's face, we probably could identify that it was a dog. We didn't need to see the whole body. We didn't need to see the tail. You could probably guess a dog from even just looking at a tail, right? The back end of a dog. You can see that, oh, it's got the, I don't know, particular shape of a tail. That looks like a dog tail. So these recognizable pieces, it's kind of a fuzzy combination, right? If we have a picture here where we've got these obviously scales, that gives us an indication of the kinds of things that this could be. Maybe it's a lizard or a snake. And just only looking at this zoomed in part, we already have that sort of idea in our head, and we would want our models to have a similar idea, in a sense, of what it's looking at. And so this is just the zoomed in part down here, this is an image of a snake. Part of what we're doing is we're looking at those scales. That's one of the visual features that we're using to recognize it. And every single image and every single thing that we recognize in images has this property that if you look closely, you look really far in, you look really zoomed in, you'll be able to see pieces that indicate what the overall class is. So if we look at this is a wheel, but we can see that there's like this sort of pretty heavy duty uh, I don't know the correct term. I'm not a, a mechanic. But this heavy duty thing that's holding the wheel in place. So it's probably not a bicycle, and the wheel looks too thick for a bicycle. Maybe a moped or it's a fork apparently. Um, it's probably not a bicycle. It's maybe a moped or a motorcycle, right? And if we zoom out, it's a motorcycle. This is the wheel of a motorcycle. So this basic idea is that we have these visual features that we want to identify and then compose, right? So if we see scales and this kind of eye shape, this kind of head shape, that's a snake. But if we that's a different set of features to this wheel and these like handlebars and lights on the front and there's two wheels and there's mechanical pieces over there. Right? These are different visual features that are in these different images. And so we want to be able to first recognize that they exist and then identify what the composition of them means, right? Because you can have similar things that have similar features. H asks, what about a zoomed in image of a snake or a tiger that has been turned into leather? As in, an animal has been killed and then turned into a piece of like a rug or a, a bag or something like that, right? Um, yeah, so that's going to be a confusing piece of visual feature. And remember how I said it's a fuzzy thing, right? We need to see many different things. So if we see the texture, is so the name of this is a texture. When you have really zoomed in computer vision, we call this a texture. There's a texture of scales. It's a little patch of scales, and if you see scales, then that means that it could be a snake, or it could be snake skin, or it could be some other lizard or something like that. These are just indications of something. And it's really this high level composition that we're looking for, or that we hope the model can see, that'll finally get it to the final result. However, along the way, it has to have identified those sort of lower level visual features, right? And so what we're really talking about is features at different scales. Yeah. We can look at this high level and go, yeah, there's lights, there's wheels, there's mechanical parts, there's a snake head, etc. And then we kind of want to ask the question, okay, if we are going to recognize, say, a dog by there being dog-shaped ears, like ears that are shaped like a dog's, a snout that looks like a dog's snout, and a tail that looks like a dog's tail, we can then sort of recursively ask the same question. What? Hold on. But how did we know that those were the shape of a dog ear? Right? How do we know that was the snout of a dog? What does that look like? And so we recursively have the same thing. Those pieces that we want to use to identify an object, well, they themselves are going to be consisting of even finer detail, right? So instead of it's not just that we identify a dog's ear, but then how do we identify a dog's ear? Well, we're going to use the fact that this looks fleshy in some way, and it looks furry, and the exact shape of it, of course, is important. It's this floppy, fleshy thing, right? And so we need to be able to detect those pieces from the ear in order to recognize that it's a dog's ear. We can see this light covering the fur, and you can see that it's got a particular shape to it, and somehow we know that's sort of fleshy. And then again, recursively, we'll ask that again. So it's got fur on it. Okay, if it's got fur on it, how did we know what fur even looks like, right? We need, because in computers, everything has to be very precise. We need to be able to calculate it with numbers, right? It has to be very precise. So how do we know that what we're looking at is fur or hair, right? Again, we look at visual features. We got this long bits of the same color, this alternating color here. We see these like strands of color sticking out on the sides, right? And then we have these large patches of kind of the same color, but like this bright, dark pattern, right, on it. So that those are sort of features of being able to detect hair. And it's the same thing. So we've just talked about different levels of these features. It's just sort of a hierarchy of features. And you might ask, like, okay, we how do we last level, how do we even know that those are strand things? We've got to define it precisely for a computer in a way that it can calculate, right, in numbers. So how do we even tell a computer that there are these strands and it needs to look for strands in order to identify hair? Well, at this point, we've kind of gotten down to um, to pixels, right? And this is where we can start really looking at the numbers. But just want to really reinforce this. In order to detect that that was a dog and that was sorry, in order to detect that that was hair, and then that hair was part of a dog's ear, and that dog's ear was part of a dog, we had to do this processing. But we need to put it into a computer, and we need to have this explained in numbers. So how do we do that for these once we get to this like really low level pixel stuff? Because we can't really go zoom in any further, right? We can't look at the chemical structure of the hair or anything. That's not what we're doing. We're using visual features. So once we get to the level of pixels, um, we have we're gonna have to define some kind of way to find it in those pixels. And then if we can define some way to calculate from pixels directly these really simple structures of these like maybe diagonal strands, then we could potentially define how to find these other pieces, right? The hair is made up of certain diagonal strands, and then they've got patches of color that we can detect with other visual features. And we have this hierarchy of low-level features to high-level features. And if we know how to like search for certain shapes, then this whole thing kind of makes sense, right? If we know how to search for a particular shape here, and we know what composition of shapes means the hair, and we know what composition of hair and patches of color means fur, and we know what composition of fur and skin and eyes and whiskers means that it's a dog's ear and a dog's eye, then this whole procedure kind of makes sense. We'll talk about exactly how to do it at the moment. For now, we're just going to talk a bit high level, and then we'll talk about how we get there in a bit. So just hold on for a second, right? All right. So we're asking the question about finding those bright strands. We can point to it in the picture and talk to a human. You see, look at those bright strands. That means it's hair. Computers only understand numbers. Specifically, each pixel has a numerical value. For most images, you'll be looking at some number between 0 and 255. Um, and then you've got it split up into red, green, and blue. So a white pixel is a pixel that has the value in the computer of 255 for red, green, and blue, right? So if we want to define what a bright pixel looks like, that's what we tell the computer. You're looking for 255, 255, 255, okay? And if you can find that, then you can find a bright pixel, okay? If we can find a bright pixel, then we can look for a search pattern of bright pixels, like a set of them. So if we're looking for a hair in an image, which is like a bright strand with some dark pixels to the side of it, we could define like a search pattern that looks like this, and then scan through the image. We can calculate where does the image look like this one. Unfortunately, of course, hair doesn't only go in that diagonal, it also goes in many other directions. It can be a little bit curved. So if we wanted to detect hair in images, we probably would want um, many of these search patterns that look like these, right? I don't want to get too bogged down on exactly how you do the search. And in reality, the actual search patterns that are used don't look like these, but this is the basic idea. You get these search patterns, and then you can compose those search patterns. Because if this is what you could use to find hair, then you could combine that together and you could go, okay, if we find these exact arrangements of pixels, or these kinds of arrangement, not exact, these are kinds of arrangement of pixels, then that tells us that there's hair, and we could have another search pattern on the results of these search patterns, right? Now, in order to get these, like I said, these are not actually what you would use. In the past, the old way of doing computer vision before 2012, really, uh, a lot of computer vision research and effort was put into, okay, what exactly are these search patterns? We need to find the good search patterns. We need to find those low-level features that look like hairs, that look like whatever. And then once we have defined those, we can put them into an MLP or a linear regression model, and then we can do machine learning on it. And so we can do the learning on the sort of a little bit higher level features than the low level features. And this was the paradigm. It was like these deeper, if we do a big model, it just doesn't work. It doesn't learn, it just uh, fits it perfectly. And then in after 2012, there was a very famous paper, AlexNet, which kind of showed that, oh, turns out you can make it work if you have a lot of training data and you train a lot. And then that means that you can do all of it from beginning to end. You just show it images, you just have a classification at the end, and you can just train all of those features along the way, and it will just learn it. So, this is how neural networks are able to do vision. Yes, it is all learned from beginning to end. So actually, the exact features that it finds are kind of arbitrary. They're whatever the model finds is useful. But if you inspect them, they tend to align with these ideas. You have these low-level features which pick up on text, these little texture things of shapes of pixels, and then those get composed into larger shapes, into larger shapes, into larger shapes. And then the last layer is the last one that composes all of the highest level features to make the prediction at the end. Okay. And what's really important, I want to say it again, is that this is learned automatically. We never had to tell the model, this is what an ear looks like, this is what a dog looks like. All we do is show it a picture of a dog and say, you need to tell us that's a dog. We show it a picture of a person and tell it, you need to tell us that that's a person. How you figure out that that's a person, that's the magic of machine learning and deep learning. That is somehow internally it learns the search patterns that it needs to look for in order to make that happen. But again, it's still hierarchical. It's still low level features of these pixels into high level features, so being composed into high level features. This is how computer vision neural networks work. Um, and you can kind of see this because it has to work this way because we have layers of computation where we start with pixels at the input and then we compose something out of that, and then we compose something out of that, and then we compose something out of that, and we compose something out of that. Each layer uses the output of the previous layer as its input. So it kind of has to do this. Now, since it's all learned, I just want to make a short note on the importance of training data. Remember, if we're doing this, if we're looking at this part, someone can come along and say, I know what a dog looks like. I can sort of draw a dog. So there's some amount of information being included that you can include as a person that you know you can introduce your own knowledge into the system. It didn't work very well. It's hard to define what a dog looks like. So it turns out learning all the features is better, but that does still mean that you can't inject directly your knowledge of what a dog looks like. You can't tell the model a dog looks like something with a long snout with a big black nose. You just can't tell the model that. There's just no way to do that. At least we don't know any way to do that. So that means that it has to learn everything from the data. And if it's learning everything from the data, it needs to learn everything from the data. As we talked about in the previous machine learning uh, discussions on machine learning about their data sets and the importance of coverage in your data set, same thing with this training computer vision models. You need to cover all of them. And something that often trips people up is that they think that the model can get more information than it can. So, for example, if we look at these images, they're all the same composition. They're all the same sort of shape. You got this car dead set in the middle, and then you got some surrounding ground and sky, and usually sky and a bit of background stuff. But it's that car in the middle that it's seeing. And so if you do this, if you just only show images like this, the model's going to be sort of biased. It'll only know how to detect a car that looks like this, with a car in the middle, you got the ground, and you got the sky. This is the only thing it'll know because this is the only thing it's seeing. So when you're training, you really need to make sure that you show it other images like these. If you want it to be able to detect a car, it needs to be able to see all of these different uh, ways that cars can appear, right? These are all features of cars that it would have to recognize. And so you need to have this variation in the training data for it to be able to work. So when it comes to a new image, it's never seen before. If there's something not quite in the center, there's stuff that's not quite the same, it can say that that's a car. Okay. So that is talking about how we train models. We train computer vision models in particular. Next, I want to talk about the other end of that, the end of it, which is what are we training it to do? What are the different computer vision tasks that we can have? There are three common tasks for computer vision that are sort of just like the baseline tasks that everything else rests upon. That is image classification, object detection, and segmentation. So we're now just going to go through what does that look like at the input and the output. In the same way that we looked at what an image looks like at the input, we've got the pixel-wise stuff. We're going to look at like literal data that comes out of a model for these different tasks. So we're going to start with classification. Okay, this is the simplest type of computer vision task, and the other two actually kind of are based on classification and include classification as part of them. So it's important we know about classification. It's not Classification isn't directly useful by itself most of the time. There are some use cases, obviously, but usually you want detection or segmentation for most of your computer vision tasks. Okay, so what is classification? Classification is answering the question, what is this image mostly showing? What is it mainly showing? There's a single classification for the whole image. So it means that the image kind of has to have one thing in it. And the way that it does this, instead of in regression, remember, we got regression and classification. This is classification. Regression predicts like a floating point number, a single number, so the output is just one number. For classification, the model outputs many numbers, and each of those numbers is kind of like a score for different classes. So in this case, the model, that shouldn't be cat, that should be rat. Anyway, um, the model has 5 classes that it could predict for. Dog, wolf, cat, and rat. It should be rat for that. Sorry about that. Dog, wolf, fox, cat, or rat. And then the model is expected to give a score for which of them it thinks it is. And so in this case, if it's a good model, maybe it would say it's 57% likely to be a dog, it's 35% likely to be a wolf, 5% likely to be a fox, 2% to be a cat, 1% to be a rat. What you'll find with these models is it's all based on probabilities. It's all like, what is it most likely to be? And so it's pretty much impossible for the model to give 100% one thing and 0% other things. And usually you don't even want that, right? Because if there's kind of half of one thing in the image, it would be a good idea. It would tell you that the model's able to recognize things. If it said, maybe it should say partly that there's a house, that this image should be classified as house, for example. Maybe it should have been that. This is just a toy example that it's not a real model, right? So this is image classification. This is the basis of the other ones, and you need to make sure you understand that what the model is doing is making a score per class. And then if we want to say, what did the model think it was? Well, we just take whichever one was the highest score. In this case, it was dog. So in this case, we say that the model predicted that this was a dog. And that's how we take a model that produces 5 numbers and turn that into a classification, which is a categorical thing. Numbers to category. Okay. So the input is image, pixel data, output is numbers. What if 2 or more classes had a tied score? That is effectively impossible. Numbers in this situation, they're not round numbers. They're not 57%. They're 56.95213721993%. Continue on. So actually having it exactly equal never happens. You can always tell that one is higher than the other. And if they're the same, I mean, it doesn't matter anyway, right? All right. So next we're going to talk about object detection, where image classification was a basis. Object detection is what you use when there's kind of a lot of things in the image and there's no singular thing that should be the whole image is classified as, right? If you look at this image here, there's quite a few different things in this image, which means that a single classification for the image doesn't make sense. So object detection, where object classification was like, what is the singular thing in the image what is the singular thing in this image? Object detection is what and where are the things, are the objects in this image. So that means that it has two parts. It has a localization and it has that classification as well for that localization. So it'll look like this. We have some image data coming in, these pixel data coming into the model, and what we want from the model is we need it to tell us, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different objects. And then for each of those objects, there is a bounding box and there is a classification. And so that can be shown visually like this, but we also want to look at it as what does it look like when it's coming out of a computer, when we're talking about computer level stuff. So we'll look at that in a second. I just want to firstly like really zoom in on this. For each object, the model needs to produce sort of a crop or a box around the thing, and then it's got a classification for that thing. So in this case, we're just looking at the first object. This is the square. We would hope that the model would tell us that it's 82% square, 16% clamp, 6% plane, 1% pencil, 1% pen. So this is definitely a square. It strongly thinks this is a square tool, right? And so if we think about the overall output of a model, in this case, we can actually turn that into a table. We can say the first box, the first thing, which is a square, that has a box where the X value of the top left is 122, the Y value is 58 from the top, the width is 318 pixels, the height is 243 pixels, and then we have a look at the classification. Just looking at this row, right? So previously we sort of drew it like vertically, but now we're going to look at horizontally. It's made a prediction that it was 82% chance of a square, 0% chance of it being a bit, like a drill bit, 0% chance of it being glasses, 16% chance of it being a clamp, 0% chance of it being a hammer, 6% chance of it being a plane, 1% chance of it being a pencil, 1% chance of it being a pen. And again, that means that for the first box, the model thinks that that is a square. So this is really what you'll get out of a model. You get this list of boxes where you have the localization information, where it is, how big the box is, and you'll have a classification for that box. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So object detection, that seems like, is that everything we need to get from images? We just need to know where things are, and then if we know where things are, maybe we can have a robotic hand to manipulate them, right? Well, there's another kind of thing in an image which doesn't really lend itself to object detection, and that is sort of regions of the image. So looking at this image, yeah, you could break this path up into individual stones, but it's kind of more important for understanding what's in an image that we understand that this is where the path is, which is where you can walk, and this is where foliage is, this is where like some plants are, and that's where you shouldn't walk, right? So if we're thinking about understanding what's in an image, detection doesn't really make sense here. We're not going to detect every leaf here. That would be ridiculous. So we have this other idea of what we're going to detect in the image. We're going to have these regions of things. And so when we have an idea of regions of things, we're doing segmentation. Formally or technically, numerically, inside of a computer, what this means is that every single pixel now has a classification. So just to recap, we went from image classification where the whole image has classification. Then we have object detection where each thing has a classification, and then we have a box to say where it is. And then this last one, segmentation, we say each pixel now has a classification. And in each of those cases, a classification is really just a list of scores for different classes, right? And then whichever class has the highest score, that's the class that it is, right? Okay. So as that's why I said at the beginning as well that classification sort of underlies these other two, this detection, object detection, and segmentation. Um, we haven't talked about how the model does it. Not that important. Mostly it's the same. Usually it's just an extra bit on the end of the model, which turns it from classification into these, turns it from classification into these more advanced things. Because, as we talked about in the previous section, even when you're just doing classification, the model still needs to build up those low-level features into high-level features in order to be able to understand it. And so it just turns out that we can make these detection and segmentation models out of image classification models with extra bits. You do need to have extra training, extra bits on the end of the model, but the core part of the model is often the same between these different tasks. Okay. All right. So this is segmentation. This is actually technically called semantic segmentation. There's two kinds of segmentation that you should be aware of. There's semantic, which we just talked about, and there's instance segmentation. And so semantic segmentation says that is just every pixel you have a class. And that means that the output of your model is uh, pixels like height by width by number of classes. So each pixel has a number per class. But what that means is that if you have like a pile of apples, they're all just going to be called apples. So if you, for whatever reason, need to have detection and segmentation at the same time, we have another kind of segmentation, which is instance segmentation, which is kind of, yeah, that detection as well as segmentation. So it says, here is an object, but also this is the exact boundary of the object, right? We have here is an apple, but also we've labeled each of these pixels as part of that apple or not part of that apple inside of that bounding box. Okay. So in some sense, instance segmentation just combines semantic segmentation and object detection. And this is probably the most advanced kind of uh, computer vision task. Obviously, you still need to use semantic segmentation for things like grass and paths and dirt and stuff like that. But usually, for the most advanced kind of computer vision robotic control, you're looking to get instance segmentation. That's what you really want to get to. Okay. So that's all of the different tasks. And in terms of what you want to use them for, yeah, you want to use object detection for finding discrete objects in a scene. So if you ever seen like a CCTV footage and you see that it's tracking pedestrians, or there's a car coming past and it's got them, or self-driving cars, those are all using object detection. They're saying that here's a thing in the image, and we've found what it is. That's a car. Okay, it's a car over there, and that's a person over there, and so we can know that that's the case and react accordingly. And then semantic segmentation is for understanding, okay, that's the background over there. That's some ground, that's some dirt, that's the sky, etc. That's helping you understand scene composition. Are we outdoors, are we indoors, that sort of thing. So here's just a single case study that actually uses both of them, right? Both, there's no one thing that's better than the others. They're for different purposes. And this is Dr. Joshua Millwood's research that he's been working on. He's been working on medical imaging. And so he, for his projects, he uses images like these, which are these stained uh, microscope images. So there's skin, there's a skin that's been stained with a particular purpley stain, and then looked at under a microscope, and you can see that there's cells and tissue structures in here. Now, of course, you need to be trained to know what those exactly look like, but we can train a computer to do that stuff for us. So if we want to be able to diagnose diseases, sorry, I should say, these can be used to diagnose diseases by trained professionals to know what to look for. This particular tissue structure doesn't look good, these cells don't look right. We can start to do that in a computer by having these different computer vision tasks. We can do cell detection, where we can say, all right, there are these cells here. I don't know exactly how. I'm not trained to do that, but the computer says that's where that is, and Josh's research shows that yep, those are cells. So you can know like a distribution of these cells. All right, there's a good number of cells, or there's a bad number of cells. And separately, there's tissue segmentation, where you can say, okay, this is the region that's this kind of tissue, and then this is the region that's a different kind of tissue, and those can be looked at more easily. You can look at how many cells are inside of this tissue, how many cells are inside of that type of tissue, that kind of information, and then it allows you to start doing things automatically with a computer. And so this is an example of using both in the same project. So in summary, we have four different tasks we've talked about, where two of them are just different kinds of segmentation. We have classification. The output is one class label, whole image. What is the most salient object in this image? So for example, if this is an image here, the output is apples. Or more realist, more like deep, we have a distribution over the different classes, and then apples was the one that the model scored the highest. Then we have detection. Input is an image, output is a bunch of boxes, where each box has a class label and a bounding box, like the extent of where the box is. And that's for each object in the scene. So that answers the question, what are the things, what are the objects in this image, and where are they? Then we have semantic segmentation, put in an image, get out a map for each pixel in the image. What is there? In this case, we've just distinguished between apples and background. So the background is sort of not annotated here, but you know, this pixel is apple, this pixel is background. And so that answers the question, which class does this pixel belong to? Which pixels is this? Or alternatively, which pixels does each class belong to each class? Same thing, just said slightly differently. We can collect the same information from the output. And then we have instance segmentation, which, as I said, is kind of a combination of detection and semantic segmentation. It is, instead of outputting a label and a box, we have a label and this map of, for each pixel, is it part of the object or is it not part of the object? And so which pixels belong to each individual object? Well, which objects are there and which pixels belong to them as well? Okay, so those are the computer vision tasks. Now we're going to talk about multi-class classification metrics. So it's a little bit different. We've been talking about computer vision, but multi-class classification is a big deal in computer vision. And we want to be able to measure, right? All of it was about classification, right? We talked about classification underlies detection, semantic segmentation, instance segmentation. It's all about classification plus something else, right? So if we want to evaluate how good a model is, we need to have metrics for classification. And in particular, we need to have metrics for multi-class classification. We need to have metrics for more than one class. It's not just apple or not. It's, is it apple? Is it a dog? Is it a person? Is it a house? Is it whatever? So previously, we talked about classification metrics. We looked at a confusion matrix, which is what we see here. And we said that for binary classification, not multi-class, for binary classification, if we look at this and we say predicting it's a mushroom or not a mushroom, right? A true or false is whether the model, sorry, the name of each possibility has two parts to it, true, false, false, negative. And the true, false part just says, was the prediction from the model correct or not? And sort of more nebulously, we had this positive, negative. And that was in response to the question, did the model think it was the positive class or the negative class? Did it think it was the thing or did it think it was not the thing? And then from this, we can compute a bunch of metrics. We can compute accuracy, precision, recall, and F1 score. That's all well and nice for binary classification, where we have is thing or is not thing. But if we have multi-class classification, it's not just is it this thing or not this thing. It is it this thing or is it this other thing or is it this third thing or is it this fourth thing? So we're going to take this binary classification thing and we're going to look at it as if it was multi-class classification. Okay, instead of it being just predict M and not M, we're going to just refer to them as M and R. Is a mushroom, is not an R, just M and R. We're going to call them M and R. Okay, so what you'll notice is that positive in this case means that the model predicted M, not that the model predicted R. Predicting R is negative. Predicting M is positive, predicting R is negative. You can see it in the columns. Predicting M is positive, predicting R is negative. But again, that's only in sort of reference to this M class, that it is a mushroom, right? If we want to talk about it in terms of class M and class R, well, why is M special? Why is M positive and R negative? Couldn't we do it the other way around? And the answer is yeah, we could. What if we swap which class was considered positive? In that case, the true positives and the true negatives basically swap, and the false positives and false negatives swap. Sort of, you can imagine it's sort of a flipping of the thing. And so if we compare this one, instead of it being predict M here being positive, it's predicting R as positive, predicting M being negative. Okay. So all we've done is, in this case, we've just swapped sort of the reference class. Which class are we talking about? The positive is that we predicted for that class. Previously, that was predicting class M, that was a positive. And now for this one we're looking at, predicting R is a positive. So let's revise. The true, false, and positive, negative ideas haven't changed. All that's changed is the definition of positive versus negative. True, false hasn't changed either, right? It's still only true when the model has predicted correctly and false when the model has predicted incorrectly. But the definition of positive and negative sort of changes based on which class we're looking at, right? So that means that if we want to calculate, and now if we want to calculate precision or recall, we actually have two ways to calculate, or one way to calculate it per class. It's a precision for class M. It's a precision for class R. It's a precision for class whatever other classes we have. So this here is kind of a combined confusion matrix where we've labeled each square based on both using class M as a reference class and class R as the reference class. And so in this case, we can see this is a true positive for class M, but it's a true negative for class R. And same thing over here. This is a false negative for class M, and it's a false positive for class R. Now, I just want to look at this square again and talk it through one more time because repetition helps with this kind of thing. False negative for class M. I'm just going to talk that through again. The model got it wrong because it's a false. It's a negative for class M because the model predicted class R. So remember this column is class R. So it's a false negative. The model predicted class R. It was actually class M. That's false. Model was wrong. And it's a negative because a negative when we're talking about class M because the model predicted not M or R in this case. So again, we have metrics and we have different metrics for the different classes. We have a precision for class M and we have a precision for class R. And the formula is the same. It's just instead of it being the true positives, it's the true positives when we're talking about class M and the false positives when we're talking about class M. So let's just quickly do a calculation. What is the precision for class M? So precision, let's just look back at the formula. It's true positives plus false positives. True positives plus false positives. So the model has predicted M when it shouldn't have. That's a false positive for class M. So it's true positives divided by the sum of this column. So we have 120 true positives over 120 plus 22. That ends up being 84.5%. And then for class R, same thing. It's the true positives of class R. Sorry, down here, 36. It is R, predicts R. That's true positive for class R. Divided by true positives plus false positives. So a false positive, again, the model predicted R because it's a positive, but it was wrong about that R, meaning it's a false positive. That's that 45. So it's 36 over 36 plus 45. That's 44% precision for class R. Okay. Hopefully that's all making sense. Because now we're going to look at the more realistic case, which we've already seen in the lab a little bit. which is this generalizing that same idea out to um, many classes. In this case, four, but it could be 10, could be 100, whatever. We notice that there's four options for the model. It could predict A, or it could predict B, or it could predict C, or it could predict D. But there's four like possible correct answers. It could be the image is actually of class A, the image is actually of class B, the image is actually of class C, the image is actually of class D, which means that there's 16 possible situations, right? The model predicted A and it was A. The model predicted B and it was A. The model predicted C and it was A. The model predicted D and it was A. And then the model predicted A and it was actually B. The model predicted B and it was actually B, etc. And so we can label each of these squares with false negative, false positive, true positive. When you get to four classes, you actually can't do true negatives for this. It doesn't make sense to do true negatives in this case, which is fine. If you look at the formulas for all of them, they don't actually use the true negatives. So for precision recall in F1, you don't actually need a true negative. So it turns out to be okay. All right, so let's have a look and what would be the cells that we would use to find the recall for class A. So class A, we're predicting for class A. So we're looking at true positive. Okay, actually I'm gonna ask you guys, and I'm gonna get some of you to tell me which cells you think it's gonna be to calculate recall for class A. Someone want to hazard a guess?
Is that
So what's the
column
top?
one?
Okay, so we're looking at column one. Okay, when we're doing this calculation, each of these, we need to do a calculation with the squares, right? With these well, rectangles, these like places in this 4 by 4. So if we're gonna, there's gonna be a number here, 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 and we're gonna figure out what do we have to put into this equation to calculate this this result by adding up those numbers. So what's the true positives for class A? Is there one square, more than one square, that are the true positives?
Just the one square.
Which one is it?
Um, TPA, the top.
TPA, true positives A. This is the true positives for class A. Cool, that's good. Yep, cool. So that's that part. What about false negatives for class A? Where are they in this image? In this confusion matrix?
Where it says FNA.
FNA. So where's that?
So
Can you
it's
just tell me?
it's the rest of the top row added
Rest of the
together.
top row added together. Cool. So this is false negative A. This is another set of false negatives for A. This is another set of false negatives for A. So let's just, again, I'm going to repeat because it's useful. So you're correct. You're absolutely correct. That's where the false negatives are. So we want to find the recall. We add them all up in those ways. But false negative A, let's talk it through again. We're talking about class A. So predicting anything other than class A, that's a negative. And if it should have been A, then that's a false negative. It's a false negative for class A. So that's why predicting for if it should have been A and we predicted B, that's a negative and it's wrong, so it's false. Predicting C, that's also a negative and it's false, wrong, so it's false. And predicting D, that's a negative. We're not predicting for like we didn't predict class A, so it's a negative and it's wrong, so it's a false. So these are the false negatives for class A. Okay. One last thing before the break. So good job. Thank you for that. And one last thing before the break. We have just talked about calculating per class metrics, which means that we have, in this case, we have four classes, which means we have four separate recalls, we have four separate precisions, and four separate F1 scores. It's useful to look at these things, but if we're going to report to other people how good the model is, usually we want to aggregate these into sort of one metric. And so what we'll usually do is instead of reporting each class's recall and precision, unless it's relevant, like sometimes it's relevant. Sometimes we say, okay, this one class had a really bad precision, and we maybe want to investigate that one. So we'll talk to other people. Like when we're reporting what the model did, we'll say that this one class had really bad precision. But if it's just sort of an even spread, we'll tend to just sort of aggregate them. So how do we aggregate them? There's two main ways that we aggregate, and they are called because of a library that has decided to call them this way, the sklearn library. They're called macro averaging and micro averaging. Macro averaging says just take the average of the precisions. This is like the simplest way to do it. Calculate precision for class A, precision for class B, precision for class C, and just take the average over them. Now, this is good in some ways because it means that we're sort of counting each class as important, right? Each class has the same weight in this situation. However, sometimes we don't want that. Say there's like 10% of your data is class A, 10% of your data is class B, and 80% of your data is class C. Maybe in that case, maybe, this is definitely not usually, not all the time, but maybe we want to say, okay, that means that the examples in class A and B are being counted for more than the examples from class C. So maybe we want to actually balance it by the number of examples. So that's where micro averaging comes in. You're going to compute the metric per class. You're going to multiply. This is just a formula. The most important thing is just that we're weighting each example equally. And that means that if there's 80% in C, we're sort of treating each example as equally important instead of having this situation where each example isn't important. I would say usually you care about macro more than the micro because usually the classes have different importances. So if you're looking at predicting disease, then you really want to know like which disease is it. If it always gets one disease wrong, that's kind of a big deal, more of a big deal than if you did this averaging. So macro averaging is like that, but the micro averaging is kind of just your most simple overall metric of how well did it go. And comes back to what we talked about when we talked about metrics, about how you need to use different metrics to express different ideas and different failures of the model. Okay, so those are the two different ways, macro and micro averaging. Okay, so in summary, visual features are important for recognizing objects. That is both for humans and for computers. And neural networks will learn visual features from data because they're a machine learning algorithm. They learn those visual features automatically. There are, and we'll talk about more about that in the next lecture. Then we want you to make sure that you're aware of the three most common computer vision tasks: classification, detection, and segmentation, which we've talked about. And we want you to be aware of multi-class classification about how we compute metrics per class and then we aggregate them and how we have a reference class to calculate per class. Okay, so that's the end of lecture one. Thank you for your attention and attendance. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So at 6:08 or 6:09 maybe, we'll meet back and we'll continue on with the next lecture, lecture 6. So go drink some water, go to the bathroom, etc. See you guys back in about 5 minutes. Okay. Hope you all had a peaceful break. Got to digest some of the information and perhaps digest a bit of food or water. Um, we're going to continue on with lecture 6, which is, let me just share my screen and make sure that we can all see that. Okay, I just want to double check everyone can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Thank you for confirming. Uh, so last lecture, we just talked about uh, computer vision models. We talked about visual features and how those get composed. Then we talked about the different computer vision tasks that you could train a model on. And then we talked about evaluating those models. Now we're going to dig in to a bit more into a bit more detail into exactly how training an image classification model works. Sort of, yeah, just the more details of how that works. So we're going to look again at sort of visual features and their like how do we get to them in particular. We're going to be looking at this from the same perspective we had when we were looking at machine learning algorithms at the beginning. So in lecture 3, I think it was, we were talking about those 4 ingredients of machine learning. You've got your data, your model, your loss function, and your optimization algorithm. We're going to talk about training a computer vision model in those terms now, um, and how that ends up getting to the result that we want. Um, and then we're going to be talking about hyperparameter tuning because up until this point, we haven't really talked about any decisions you can make. We've talked about like this is just how it works. This is just how the algorithm works. But there's configuration options in how it works, and you need to, part of your learning for the subject, you need to figure out how to change those configuration options, those hyperparameters, to make them good. And we'll look at what good means for hyperparameters here. And then the last part, we're going to have sort of a general discussion about neural networks, about the kinds of layers and architectures you're likely to see if you go out and make your own models, especially within computer vision space. And you'll be looking at that as well in the lab. So at the end of this lecture, we want you to be able to, at a very high level, be able to explain the process of training, and specifically training an image classification model, and what hyperparameters are and how those choices could affect the model. Not necessarily how they will, but could. And we want you to be able to explain that process and be able to have a general idea of what it looks like to train a model. Then, separately, we want you to be able to diagnose issues such as overfitting or poor generalization as part of this. And so that's how you choose as hyperparameters. That's diagnosing issues and then changing hyperparameters to fix those issues. So we'll talk about the relationship there. So getting started, we're going to train a computer vision model. Remember, when we looked at MLPs in lecture 3, we talked about the training process as being an iterative process. And of course, it's a machine learning process where we use labeled data. So an image classification data set is a set of images with associated class labels. And so if we want to train a classification model, an image classification model, we need to have both images and known class labels, which is the answer it's supposed to give, so that we can measure how wrong the model is. So if we need a classification, like we just need a class label for each of the images, just think for a moment, what else, if we want to train a detection model, what would we need? We would need the boxes and the class labels for the detection model. And then for a segmentation model, we would need to know for each pixel, what should the model be predicting, right? There's this training process where modifying the model so that it is more correct in the process. And so we had a picture that looked kind of like this. This is sort of updated for images. And we'll talk about that process. So we've got three steps to discovering the model, and those three steps get repeated. So we start with sort of a batch of images, just a little collection of images that we're going to put through the model. And for each image, we put it through the model makes a prediction. And for each image, we also know the correct answer. This known answer, this class label. And so we're going to put what the model gave as its answer and the known answer into a loss function. And that's going to calculate how wrong the model was. How far away from predicting the correct class was the model. Then that error goes into these algorithms called a backpropagation and gradient descent. And we're not going to look at them. They're kind of math wizardry that ends up calculating how do we change the parameters of this model. Now, this is a neural network model. And if you recall, neural networks, they have a lot of parameters. They have these layers of computation, and between each layer, or sorry, within each layer, there is a bunch of parameters that need tweaking and adjusting and choosing what the value should be. Well, this is a process, an iterative process of slowly adjusting those parameters inside of the model so that they become good, right? Because if we can calculate how wrong it is, and we can calculate how to do better from how wrong it is, then we can iteratively improve those parameters. Now, this is kind of for any computer vision task. You have images coming in, and then you have some outputs. It's just for detection, instead of the output being the class labels, just the single class labels, it would be those boxes, and you would have a loss function that calculates how similar the boxes are as well as the classification, right? So in words, that training process, we've got these numbers, 1, 2, 3. We've got 1, 2, 3. In words, first, we use the network to make a prediction to get an output. Then we measure the loss between the prediction and the known answer. And then third, we update the parameters to slightly improve the loss. That's for complicated math reasons, we always need to do it slightly. If we try to go too far, we could try to step like in a direction too far, then the model goes wrong, and we'll have a look at what goes wrong there in a moment. But these are the three sort of key steps that goes on in training a neural network. And we repeat these. We slightly improve the loss every time. But each time we repeat it, we use a different batch. So the first time we do it, we do this batch. Second time we do it, we do this batch. And then we do this batch. And then we do this batch. And we do this batch. And we go through the whole network and iteratively improving the parameters. And again, for a sort of mathsy reason, it's important that every single time we do this, we use a different batch and that we're not reusing images until we have to. Okay, that's just part of the maths that kind of guarantees you're going to get a reasonable result, or it's the only way to get a reasonable result. And so this is a training process. This is the training loop. This produces the parameters of the neural network, right? We have, before this point, defined the structure of the model, the neural network, and this process is just choosing the exact value for each of the parameters, which is to say that this process is the optimization algorithm. It is the algorithm that produces the parameters. That's what we define the optimization algorithm to be. And what's important about this is that once we start it running, it's automatic. Yeah. Once we start it running, it'll just find those parameters eventually. Like it'll just loop the amount of times we've told it to loop, and it will find those parameters. Okay. What's cool about that is that like all we're giving it is an image and we're giving it a class label. So we're looking at the first layer and the last layer of the model. We're just giving it the image, the pixels, and we're telling it the class, and then it figures out automatically through these layers of computation what the weights and the parameters should be. And remember, we've got many layers of computation, and each layer contains parameters that we've got to choose the values for. And then each layer uses the output of the previous layer as its input to calculate the next thing, and we have this like composition idea of like calculating like features along the way. And what we're learning here, what this process learns automatically, kind of this is the magical part to most people. Automatically, it learns how to find diagonal strands. It learns how to find hair. And like I said, it kind of has to do this, has to have this composition in order to get to the end where it can classify this as a dog. So, like finding these parameters is automatic, and we have this sort of mess. I've described it as kind of a magical process almost that finds the parameters. You just set it up, you let it run, and you get parameters. So that means that training a neural network should be easy, right? Yes and no. It's a very sophisticated algorithm that it can do that comes up with to be able to classify the images. So in one sense, it is easy in that we don't have to define exactly what each shape looks like, and it can work. But it's not easy in another way, which is that the training process actually has quite a few configuration options that we have to set when we're setting up this training. And if you have bad configuration, the model's going to train badly and you're going to get a bad model at the end. And it turns out that most configuration values are bad, and you as the person who has to make a deep learning model, what you're actually doing, the work that you do, is finding the good configuration options. And that's what you're going to be doing in assessment two, in fact. These configuration options are called hyperparameters. So parameters are in the model. These are the numbers inside of it, like a linear regression model has A times something plus B times something, and those A and B are the parameters. For a neural network, you have many of these. You have thousands, millions of these parameters, and those are all automatically found by this training process. And then we have these other configuration options, which are in some ways like you tune them in the same conceptual way that the algorithm is automatically tuning the parameters in the model. So we call these hyperparameters. These are like the meta parameters almost, right? These are parameters that need to be tuned, but they're not going to be tuned automatically. They're not going to be tuned by the algorithm. They're going to be tuned by you. So there's another loop that goes on top of this. And this is the development loop. This is what you do as a person. So when you're developing a neural network, what you're going to do is you're going to run that code to train a model. That was what we just talked about, right? That automatic method to find the parameters. And then as it's going, you're going to monitor. And you're going to monitor as it's going, or you're going to look at the end, you're going to observe at the end what the training did, whether it was good or bad. And then you're going to, based on what you see, choose different configuration options. You're going to choose different hyperparameters, right? So now the question, of course, is, well, two questions. What are the hyperparameters? And two, how do you tune them? I'm going to start with talking about how do you tune them, the basics of tuning them, because it's the same for all of the hyperparameters. We're trying to find good training. Okay, well, what does good training mean? Okay, I'm going to take one step back. What is good training? Well, a good model is a model with low loss, right? We've already defined loss as being a function which measures how good the model is. So if a model has low loss, then it is a good model. So that's the basic idea. The loss should be low. If the loss is low, the model is good. But really, when we're doing this, there's a more complex thing that we do. Instead of just looking at the final loss, because that usually doesn't tell us enough information, what we'll look at is we'll look at the evolution of loss over training. Because training is iterative, right? After each iteration, we have new parameters, and we can measure the loss again at that point in time, right? And so what we want to see is we want to see the loss going down. So here is an animation of the house price data set that we've been looking at a bunch. And on the left, we have a representation of the model at each point in time. So each frame of this animation is a new set of parameters for the model, and the model is this line. This model tells us in comes the area. The model will give us a value for the price along the way. And so that's what's on the left. We're seeing it sort of settle into a good spot that tells us that it's like close to the data. And on the right, we have a time graph, like along the bottom, it's a number of steps, also the amount of time it's taken. And we can see that over time, the loss goes down. And that when we're looking at data that's in higher dimensions, we can't see this graph on the left. We can't see that it actually hits those points pretty well. We can't see that. It's in a million dimensional space. An image, for example, is a thousand dimensional thing, a thousand dimensional point, or a row in a table that has 20 columns, right? We can't visualize that. So for this simple case, we can visualize it. We can see, oh yeah, that's a good model. But for the higher dimensional cases, how do we know it's a good model? Well, what we do is we look at this graph on the side, which we can always make, right? Loss is always a scalar. It's always a single value. So we can always plot time, steps, iterations, epochs, whatever we want on the x-axis, versus the loss. And we have this idea of an ideal shape for what the loss should look like, which tells us the model is learning well and it's getting to a good solution. And it's kind of remarkable, but we really can just look at the loss curve and you can tell a lot about what's happened in the training by looking at this loss curve. So this is a loss graph that we have is the axis, and the loss curve is the shape of the line that it makes on that loss graph. And we can tell a lot about how well the model is working by how close it is to what we call the ideal loss curve. So the ideal loss curve looks a bit like this. We have a rapid improvement at the start, a few steps, big improvement in the loss. It should pretty much always keep improving the whole time. And if it's improving, then we don't want to stop it early, right? So long as it's improving, we want to keep training. But usually, eventually, you get to a point where if you're training longer, it doesn't really improve that much. And you get this sort of tail end where there's sort of negligible improvements at the end of training. And if you trained for twice as long, it probably would stay about the same loss value. This is what we want to see. This means that the model has learned well. And we need to choose hyperparameters to get a loss curve that look as close to that as we can get. So we would say that tuning hyperparameters is essentially just tweaking those configuration options, those hyperparameters, to make that loss graph look as much like that ideal graph as we possibly can. Just one extra piece of information on that before we continue is, of course, we don't just look at the training loss, we want to look at the testing loss. We've talked about this with the evaluation metrics. We kind of don't care too much about the training performance, but we do care about the training loss because that tells us about how well it's training. Um, we want the training loss and the testing loss to look very similar. That if they don't look the same, and we'll look at some examples of what that looks like, but if they don't look the same, then that usually means there's something wrong. It means that the training data doesn't is somehow different to the testing data. And that means that the evaluation of generalization kind of breaks apart. Okay, so not only do we want the training loss to look like the ideal loss curve, we want the testing loss to look like the ideal loss curve. This is the best possible thing. This is not a real graph. This is like a cartoon of it. So, but I mean, you saw with this one, right? This is what it kind of looks more like. This is a loss curve. This is pretty ideal, right? We have that rapid improvement, and then it sort of slowly doesn't improve too much over time. Maybe we could have stopped a little earlier, even. And then we've got the training loss versus testing loss. And so let's have a look. Can you guys tell me, what do you reckon? Do you think that this is a good loss curve or a bad loss curve? Would you shout it out?
Good.
You think it's good?
Yeah.
Okay. Why do you say it's good?
Um, I mean, it starts off higher,
Yep.
and then
Loss is
eventually
high,
flattens out.
and it flattens out.
And then the testing loss is of the similar shape.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
it's
That's good.
possibly could have been stopped a bit earlier, but other than that, it's got that shape that we're looking
It's got
for.
that shape we're looking for. Yeah, that's good. That's right. So this is a good graph. And you'll know that there's something doesn't look quite the same, which is that this has got on the graph, you've got this like big steep part and it goes from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph. something you should be aware of when you're looking at these graphs is that the sort of y scale is a decision. So if we instead decided to graph this from 10 to the negative 5 to 10 to the negative 2 times 10 to the negative 3 about here, we would see that sort of steeper graph. And so maybe this graph, the problem here isn't that the model trained badly. The problem is just the graph wasn't scaled right, right? But the actual overall shape is still good. So that's why this is good. All right. What about this one? Do we think this is a good one or a bad one? Okay, we're seeing some good. Does someone want to say why? Like, this has got a bunch of. This doesn't look like this. Why is this okay?
Looks like it is a bad one
Looks like a bad one. Okay, why is it a bad one?
because too many spikes. There is no smooth current.
Okay, too many spikes. It's
Actually,
noisy.
it
Okay.
looks okay, right? Because at the end, it's kind of learning and lower anyway, right? Doesn't matter where it's kind of up and down, but the trend is going down.
Yeah.
Actually, just a question regarding the previous one.
Okay.
So
Yes.
even though it's a good learning loss curve, but the model itself, it's showing that the model itself is not good, right? Because there's still a lot of loss. Is that
It
correct?
could be. It could be. It does depend. Sometimes this might be bad. I would say that the training procedure is generally reasonably good. Yeah, actually, it would really depend on this loss, right? So maybe this loss is too high, and maybe the lot you'd have to look at the accuracy. If the accuracy is like
Okay.
20% and this is happening, that's bad. But the shape is good, so that's a really good starting point. So I guess there is a caveat on this one that if the loss is too high, if the model performance is actually too bad and it just settles there and it never improves, that is a problem and you'd need to deal with that. But usually when you see this, this is usually just a graph scaling issue.
But Brendan, I was looking at that graph,
Mm-hmm.
and because it's not decreasing, the loss is remaining steady.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to me it's like a bad model because it's not improving. Like it's just stabilized and then just
All models. So if you see this flat line at the end, that's a really good sign. That
or
means
is it?
that means that the model, yeah, that means
It's
that the model
consistent.
is consistent and it's not doing because if you have especially with a smaller data set, it can like jump between them. If you have a small data set with these like spiky thing, this might be the difference between 7%, oh sorry, maybe 78% up here and 83% here, like a 5% gap between these things. If you see this up and down, it's and sorry to finish this one, this is a pretty good graph. It has that shape of like constantly improving, and they sort of stick together for the most part. It's noisy though, which means that there's something that could be improved, but overall it's pretty good. And so this smooth thing means that the model is stable, which is a nice property to have, and that you're not getting this like swing in the testing accuracy of like a couple percentage points. If you have that swing in the testing data set, then it's kind of hard to tell if you're comparing across models then, right? Because was the last step on a down or was it an up? Right? If the last step that it ended on happened to spike up a little bit, this model is going to look badly. It's going to look bad if you're only looking at the last evaluation.
Do you
Can I
mean,
ask?
So this is a good thing in a lot of ways. Yes, wait.
Brendan, do you mean if the model, especially the one in the right-hand side, is converging, so that means that's a good model? I mean, the test and
It's
training
good
done.
because both of them have a downward trend and they sort of stick reasonably close together. That's what's good about this. It's bad in the sense that it's got a bit of noise to it, but overall it's more good than bad.
Is that stick close together means convergent? Does it mean?
So converging usually refers to how stable it ends up being, not necessarily in a flat line, but just like if it stayed here and was like went off going up and down, but the overall trend didn't go down, then you would say that it has converged. It has converged on one kind of solution. It's not going to improve if you train it for longer. That's usually what converging means. Not that the testing loss and training loss are the same.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're not to
So
expect
what-
that the testing loss and the training loss should meet at some point, or it's the best scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, best they would be pretty equal, but usually you'll find the test loss will always be a bit worse.
Okay.
There's always a little bit of overfitting, just a little bit.
Victor,
you.
why is that the right graph is not stable, is a bit haphazard? Is it because of the learn
Well,
rate or is it
yeah, it can be because of learning rate. It can also be because of batch size. We'll talk about that in more detail
Yeah.
in the next few slides. I just want to finish like just assessing the image.
And I
And
asked,
I'm getting a feeling that it's good because of the shape, yeah.
That's right, because of the
But
trend.
but the explanation is where the money actually comes from. Explaining why is it noisy, explaining why it don't converge
Yes.
nicely, or
Well,
all the rest of it.
so if we look at this and we had a model and this was the loss curve, I would say that the model that comes out could still be very good.
Yeah. So
but let's have a look at another one.
The curve is generally in the right direction. They
Yeah. So
get to a solution. Yeah.
You don't. I guess my point here is you don't need to fix this.
Yeah, but then the explanation for why it is not perfect is up to you to explain it away.
You don't need to explain it away.
Okay.
There's just things you might want to try that could potentially improve it. But if this is the final model that you have, this would be fine as well. You could have a model and you could say, I'm done. I've trained a good model. There's no more improvements I can make, and the loss curve looks like this. That's fine. That can happen.
Okay.
can I ask about real life examples though? Because in
Yes.
my head, if you're going to learn something, you're going to start with the basics, like 1 + 1 = 2. So then you get to like algebra or something down the track. But with, say, learning from a visual point of view, you're going to start with probably like, this is a dog, this is a cat. Then probably go into, this is a dog breed A, this is dog breed B, or whatever. So realistically, when we're looking at these graphs, are we looking at it in terms of over the whole lifetime of it learning, or within sections? Because you're going to realize as you're trying to teach it stuff, mistakes that you then have to go back and fix yourself as well, aren't you?
Kind of. Okay, so Nathan, you've made a really good point, which is that like if we think about how we learn with simple things and go to more complicated things. I will point out that the default way that most people train models is not that way. It is the simplest, sort of maybe dumbest way, which is just you give it the difficult task, you just keep asking it to try and solve that task, and eventually it gets better, and the task doesn't get any easier or harder over training. What you described, it's actually called curriculum learning, and it's something that people don't often do. If you do curriculum learning, you will see this. What you'll get is a graph. I'm going to draw on this one because it's a little more clean. What you'd expect to see is you'd have like sections. You'd be easy task from 0 to 100 steps, and the model would go converging and then would sort of flatten out. And then you have a harder task, and then the loss would sort of go up and then go down again. And it would look very complicated. It would be a bunch of different things. But when we're doing normally, and what I want you to care about for this subject, don't worry about that. Just think of it as like you just give it the difficult task and it just figures out the difficult task. There's no changes in the type of data that it sees from beginning to end.
Okay.
Yeah. If the type of data changed, the loss would move around and do weird things.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So this one, we need to get through this. So I'm just going to tell you this one is obviously bad. This one in the bottom left-hand corner, this is bad. And it's bad because there's this big gap between the training loss and the testing loss, right? This means that the model is overfitting. It's doing well on the training data, but it's not doing well on the test data. That's bad. And we've got this one. This is kind of the worst case. It's not the worst case necessarily. It's just the most common bad case, I should say, not the worst case. It's like the most common bad case where you have the training losses keeps going down, but then the test loss even starts going up. And so this one here is very classic overfitting. So if you talk about overfitting, this is what you're thinking of. You've got your training loss going down, your testing loss going up. This is overfitting. This is kind of overfitting. This is more classic overfitting.
Sorry, doctor, if I may ask. Now we are assessing, like, this kind of, is it like, good or bad based, like, on the curve? Is it like, close to each other or not?
Yes.
So if they are close, that's mean like, in testing they are performing as like, it's performing on training on, so in testing performing on unseen data as it's performing on what's called
The
training.
training data. That's right.
And
Yes.
training them. And on this way, we are like, assessing this one good or bad. But in other terms, there is other point like, the loss or accuracy of the system. You are not assessing here any kind of accuracy. Because if you see the first one, the
Yep.
accuracy, as you mentioned. So in terms of what's called the performing of testing, it's performing well on the unseen data. However, like, in terms of loss, it's let's say,
So what we're looking for is we're looking for how to tune hyperparameters to get a better result. We still want to get a lower loss, but usually lowest loss comes from this ideal shape. That's just how it usually pretty much always goes. If you can get this really nice shape that it keeps decreasing over a reasonable number of steps. So the bad case of this is it'll go boom in like 10 steps, it'll go to here and then just be flat. That's kind of more indicating it's bad because it's reached the minimum loss too soon for what we'd expect. We expect number of steps to take hundreds, thousands. If it doesn't take hundreds to thousands, then there's something wrong.
yes.
And so long as we get that shape, usually the loss and the accuracy comes along with it. All right. So these are the good and bad. We're a little bit behind on what we need to, quite a bit behind on what we need to be talking about. So I'm sorry if I go quickly for the next bit. So note on the data, we've been talking about training set and testing set. Of course, the training set is the stuff we use with the optimization algorithm to select the parameters. The testing set is used to evaluate model performance and say, is this model better than that model? And then sometimes you'll talk about a validation set. Usually, if you're doing hyperparameter tuning, instead of plotting the testing loss, you want to plot the validation loss. Because if you're tuning something, you kind of don't want to tune it onto the test set. Remember, the test set is sacred. We don't tune things on the test set as much as we can. And so usually we create a new validation set that is used to tune the hyperparameters without risking the integrity of the test set. So just keep that in mind. In the lab, we'll be looking at a validation set. All right, so now we're talking about what we're trying to get. We're trying to get that ideal loss curve. And now let's look at what the levers we have in order to make that. We're trying to make this loss curve look ideal. We're changing hyperparameters. So which are the hyperparameters that we can change? There are sort of a couple of key hyperparameters that are the same for all machine learning. And then there's specific hyperparameters for each specific case. There'll be other things you can choose about how you're training. And those are all hyperparameters. Those are all things you can choose to change. So the learning rate is the first one. It controls how quickly the model's parameters change at each step of training. And remember how I said we always expect it to take hundreds to thousands of steps? It turns out you might think for learning rate, you want to set it as high as possible. You want it to learn as quickly as possible so you can save time. But just from the maths of it, that ends up not working very well. And that's why we need to look at that curve as it changes over time. It just kind of so happens that the maths makes it so that you need to have a sweet spot for the learning rate. If the learning rate is set too high, the weights in the model are going to change too dramatically with each step, and it's never going to actually learn a single good solution. It's going to sort of jump away from good solutions. It's going to jump around good solutions with the parameters. And so that's where you'll see either spiky loss or it has a very high base loss that it gets very quickly. That means your learning rate is too high. And then conversely, you can have a learning rate that's too low as well. It just means that if it's too low, the model's not going to train fast enough by the end of the training. Like you do it for 1,000 steps and you go, wow, it's 1,000 steps. It should have learned by now, and it hasn't got there. So let's have a look at those two cases. This is same data we've been looking at before. This is the house price data. If the model is set too high, the learning rate is set too high, what we end up with is a model like this, where it just finds something that kind of gets there and it's just jumping around and it's got this bit of spikiness and it just never learns what to do, never settles on a good solution. And then separately, if you have a learning rate that's too low, it will be improving, but it's just improving too slowly. In this case, it could have been a higher learning rate. So we want to have as high a learning rate as we can without having the bad parts of having a high learning rate, right? If it's too low, it just takes too long to train. Theoretically, it should get there, but also sometimes the lower learning rate doesn't even get you to the best solution. There's always this sweet spot of a good learning rate. And there's so much around choosing a good learning rate. It's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of just see what you see and see if it looks like it's too high, looks too low, change it around, or just try wild numbers and see what happens, and figure it out. So you're diagnosing the issues. If you see that really slow, steady loss, but it doesn't have that nice increases rapidly and then slows down, then that usually means the learning rate is too low. If the learning rate is too high, the loss maybe goes up more, goes up and down, goes really spiky, or it sort of gets trapped at a higher loss. And it also can quickly lead to overfitting as well. That's often what you'll see with a learning rate is too high. Another one we look at, another hyperparameter we look at is batch size. Remember when we're looking at the training data set and we're thinking about when we update the parameters, the batch size is how many images you look at before you update the parameters. So this is kind of a good estimate, or increasing batch size gives you a better estimate of what images look like in general. But if you have a larger batch size, then it also means that you don't have as much time budget to update the parameters, right? So we wanted to do 1,000 steps. If you have a batch size of 10 million images, then maybe you can only do one step of updating, and that's no good. So we need to have a smaller batch size just for practical purposes, to be able to update the parameters enough times within our time budget. So if we use this, I've just gone back a slide. Batch size, it controls how much data we show the model in one go before we update the weight. So we show a bunch of images, and then after we've shown a whole batch, we update the weights. So this is the size of that batch of how many images we show. So that's batch size, and you'll notice that theoretically, if you use the whole data set, you could have like a better estimate of what images look like and what the model's done wrong and what the model needs to improve, etc. But if you do that, it would take too long. So we always do this little, like we break it up into batches. And if you, just a little side note, because we use a batch, and that's kind of an estimate for the whole data set, sometimes you'll see gradient descent talked about as stochastic gradient descent, meaning probabilistic, like a probability thing. And that's just referring to the fact that we use batches to calculate the gradient and gradient descent, rather than using the whole data set. Just a little side bit for this. Okay.
Sorry, Brandon. So one batch is one step?
One batch is one step. One
Okay.
batch is a collection of images, and that makes one step, one change to the parameters.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Good question. All right, so
And does that mean 1 point on the loss graph?
that means 1 point on the loss graph. That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. So batch sizes, they're not as important as learning rate, but they are still important and still something we tune. If the batch size is too small, then each batch doesn't give a good picture of what's going on and what the model needs to learn, right? It sort of biases it one way towards whatever's common in that batch, and then biases it another way based on whatever common in the next batch, biases it another way based on whatever that is. So if it's too small, you'll get you'll get sort of a spiky loss. There's multiple reasons for spiky loss. It could be batch size, could be learning rate, could be some combination of the two. And because the batch size is small, you actually get to do more iterations usually, right? So you'll have the loss changing more rapidly and you'll get a bit more spiky, but it will fail to get to the same location, similar to what you would see for learning rate, which is too high. And you can conflate these, and it's not clearly separable which is which. So this is why you need to experiment with it a bit. And then if the batch size is too large, as I said, it takes up a lot more memory. Maybe if you if you set it too large, which is something can happen in lab 6 in your assignment, set it too big, sorry, just in the lab, not the assignment. If you set batch size to be too big, then it's actually going to run out of RAM, right? Because these are trained on GPUs. GPUs have a fixed amount of RAM. If you make a big batch size, it needs to hold the whole batch into RAM at once, and it's going to take a long time to compute. You're going to run out of memory, and then it's just not going to do enough update steps to get to where you want. You don't have enough update steps to get that nice curve that you're looking for. So choosing values, actually, I didn't talk about it for learning rate. I'll just mention for learning rate, the default that you should always start with is 10 to the negative 3. So 0.001 for learning rate. And then you should adjust from there based on what you see or what you want to try. You can try different values, but you always start with 10 to the negative 1, otherwise known as 0.001. For batch size, the values you want to use, you want to try values roughly between 32 to 1024. Depending on your data set, maybe 32 is even too big. Like if it's a very large images you're using, maybe it doesn't, you can only fit 8 images into your batch size. Batch size is kind of has a practical limitation to it in terms of like how big it is and how many steps you can do. So larger batch sizes usually produce better features, not always, but usually. But we need to make sure that the batch size is small enough that we can run enough optimization steps in the amount of time budget that we kind of have. Maybe we say we want to train for 3 days, then we can only do a certain number of update steps. Well, we choose a batch size that allows us to get a good number of steps in that time. Okay, so again, signs that batch size is too big. It can be overfitting, where in particular the overfitting where you have the training loss going down and the testing loss going up, because it's getting too good of an estimate of specifically the training data, not the testing data. And so it's not being encouraged to learn sort of fuzzy general features that work for everything, right? So it can start overfitting. The code won't run because the computer's running out of RAM. And if the model is learning too slowly because you don't have enough update steps, but if you increase learning rate too much, then you have a problem there. So that's another sign your sort of batch size is too big. Okay, it's learning too slowly. And then if it's too small, your model performance is pretty noisy. You got a lot of update steps and they're going up and down quite a bit, and it kind of the loss ends up higher than you'd like. Maybe you can try increasing the batch size to get a better loss. If it's really too small, you'll be again jumping between bias towards one image versus another image, and you're just sort of jumping between being good at images rather than being good at the general ideas. And so you end up with like an underfit model where the model can't learn those general features. All right, so that's batch size. Another thing you can tune is actually the number of iterations, how long you're actually going to train for. This is used in conjunction with batch size to be able to try and train, and you're sort of tweaking this together with batch size. Ideally, if we had infinite compute, maybe you would want to train it for 3 years before you get a thing out, and then maybe that would be a better model than if you train it for 3 days. But realistically, you have practical limits on this, so you need to choose how many iterations you can use that fit within your training time budget. If you're tuning these hyperparameters, you really, you need to do this multiple times. If each time you want to do this, it takes 3 days, well, how many can you realistically try in a month? Like you can only try 10 different options in a month if it takes you 3 days per thing. So number of iterations, you often want to choose it based on how many things you want to try, how long it's going to take. It's sort of a fuzzy thing. There's no obvious number to try to select, but these are the considerations you need to have when you're talking about number of iterations. Now, when you're choosing it, you'll see different things, right? If you see something like this where the loss is still going down and you're pretty happy with the learning rate and the batch size, that means that you should train the model for longer, because you really want to see that more. You want to see the amount that the loss is going down should slow down. You should have that steeper into shallower picture. And if you don't get that shallower part, then probably you just need to train for longer and you'll see the shallower part and it'll fix itself out. And then if you have this other case where it's sort of you're happy with the learning rate and the batch size, but it, hits this point and then doesn't improve for ages. Realistically, we could have stopped training at 150 steps and it would have been fine for this one, right? So that's how to tell if there's too many. And so you want to tune this a bit as well. It's all a bunch of just tuning manually, seeing what should work, what kind of works, what looks like it's working, right? And then the last concept to go along with number of batches and number of iterations is the number of epochs. So one epoch is one pass through your entire data set. Remember how you looked at the whole data set and you got a batches and you're taking a batch and then you're taking the next batch and you're taking the next batch. As you show them through, you actually don't want to show the model any images from the previous batches until you have to. And so you'll eventually run out of images in your data set. So you have 1,000 images. So you have a data set of 10,000 images and each batch is 500 images in a batch. Then you're going to have 20 batches you can show it until you've run out of images and you have to start showing it images you've seen it before. Once you get to that stage where you've run out of images, that's one epoch and you restart. That's one epoch. And you're on epoch 2. So epoch 1, epoch 2. So each epoch is one complete pass through the data set.
An epoch is an iteration. Is that correct? Or?
No, one epoch is not one iteration. So epochs, batch size, and number of iterations are related to each other in these formulas. This is just this is just the formulas. So one epoch is defined as the number of iterations times the number of batches divided by the dataset size. Sorry, dataset size is another thing. So there's a number of examples in it, right? So then if you do 1,000 iterations with 50 batch size and you have only 10,000 images, the top half is 50,000 and this is 10,000. So that'll be 5 epochs. What that means is that because these are related like this, if you pick 2, either iterations or batch size, because your dataset size is fixed already for you, you can't choose that. And if you pick 2, number of iterations and batch size, then the number of epochs just comes out of that. You can't choose epochs. If you've chosen number of iterations, if you've chosen batch size, then epochs comes out of that. And if you've chosen batch size and number of epochs, then the number of iterations comes out of that. So usually, just by default, number of epochs and number of iterations, you pick one of those two, you just choose to fix one of those, and then you tune the batch size from that. So usually we'd say maybe we do 5 epochs, and then we're going to tune the batch size. And maybe if we want to train longer, we train for 4 epochs, or maybe we train for 6 epochs. It's unusual to choose a number of iterations because the number of epochs just gives you the number of iterations by just this formula, just like how they're related to one another. Okay.
Brandon, iterations is steps, right?
Iterations is steps, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So what to set? Oh yeah. So what to set? If you can set the number of iterations, it's a measure of how many times the parameters are updated. It's the number of steps. So you want to set that. You want to fix that. You want to set it to a specific value and only explore with that number of iterations fixed when you want to make sure that the model receives the same number of updates, which sometimes you want to do. Alternatively, you can set the number of epochs, which is a measure of computation time. That's how long it's going to take you to go through the whole data set. Right? Like how many times do you go through the data set? That tells you how long it's going to run. So you set the number of epochs if you want to set the number of computation time. And as I said, usually people prefer like to set an amount of computation time because the general rule is more computation time always improves things. So it's like an unfair unfair test if you change the number of epochs between models that you're comparing. Although you can make the same argument for the number of iterations, it just people don't tend to. People don't tend to make the same argument for iterations. Okay. We are very much going to go over time for the last section of neural networks, the layers and the architectures. So I want to go through this in 2 minutes, really rapid fire for people who have to leave, and then I'll go back and I'll spend an extra. I'm going to go over time by a little bit, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go over time, but I want to make sure I can cover this really quickly for the people who want to leave at 7. Okay, so we're going to be talking about different layers. Remember that neural networks are made up of layers of computation, and the exact arrangement of their layers is called the architecture, the network architecture. So that's the layers and what their size is. We call it the network architecture, we call it the architecture. And there are three common types. There are fully connected, convolutional, and transformer networks. Since I'm skipping through really quickly, what I'll just note is that this diagram here is technically a diagram for fully connected layers, not for convolution layers or transformer layers. Convolution layers look more like this, where you have sort of a search pattern, which is what we were talking about where with the image models. So image models usually use convolution layers. And then transformer layers are a new kind of layer which performs it actually is a combination of fully connected and another kind of operation called multi-head attention, where it basically calculates an attention score over other pieces. And so it turns out transformers work better than convolution layers for images if you have a lot more training data. Speaking of training data, so those are the three layers that we use most commonly in neural networks, especially for computer vision. As I said, transformers for vision, transformer layers for vision, they require a lot more training data. So if you don't have a big data set, can you use a transformer layer? Yes. And how you would use them is with pre-trained models, right? So you can just get models that already exist, that already do these tasks, and you can use them on images. And in the lab, you'll see how that works and why that isn't always the best idea, because sometimes, or at least it's not the only thing you need to do. Sometimes they can't actually classify, detect, or segment the things that we need, or our images are actually very different to the data that those were trained on, so they just don't work for our data set. So we can use pre-trained models, but if we want to, if we want to, like the best outcome, we want to have our own data set that we take a pre-trained model and then we train on that one. So, training a model takes a lot of data, takes a lot of architecture and layers and hyperparameter tuning. And if we can, we'd like to leverage anything anyone else has done to train a similar model on their data. So we're going to take the pre-trained model, we're going to take the pre-trained architecture, the pre-trained hyperparameters that they've used to train it, and we're just going to use that on a smaller data set that we have to quickly adjust it to make it good for ours. And that's called transfer learning. And that's something we do in the lab, and it's something important you should know about. Yep, got that. So that's when, imagine we have a data set that was trained on ground level images. Kind of the features that it's going to find, those hierarchical features it's going to find, is maybe not going to be useful for medical images. It's not going to be useful for satellite images, right? So if we have a satellite image data set, then we can take a pre-trained model, and it's got some things that'll work and some things that won't. So we're going to do some fine tuning. We're basically going to do the training as we did before, but instead of starting with random weights that just didn't work at all, we're starting with weights that already know how to do something, and we're just tuning them, fine-tuning them to be good at what we're doing. And so if we are thinking about, so what should we do? What is our option of what should we do to get a good model? Well, there's kind of a scale of things. We've got options of just use a multimodal LLM, which is what we did in previous labs. You can just use a pre-trained model. So it's we don't do any training, we just use a pre-trained model. We can fine-tune a pre-trained model, or we can train a model from scratch if it's really different. And so this is a scale from less to more of a few different parameters. There's less effort on the left, more effort on the right. Less specialization on the left, more specialization on the right. Less control on the left, more control on the right. More ways to adjust it on the right and less on the left. We get a multimodal LLM, what we get is what we have. We just have it. We can't do anything with it. And it can only do classification. It can't even do detection and segmentation properly. We can take a pre-trained model and just give it one image. We maybe can use a pre-trained model to get classification, detection, and segmentation. Maybe that'll work for us. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't quite work. So maybe we collect a data set of 1,000 images so that we can get more specialization onto what we want to use it for. We're going to fine-tune that pre-trained model with thousands of images. That's what we'd need for that. And if we want to train a model from scratch, like I said, we need large amounts of data for those models. Well, we're going to need potentially millions of images to train a computer vision model from scratch. And of course, these are all useful for classification, detection, and segmentation. All right, so that's it for that one. So in summary, remember that training a neural network is an iterative process which produces the parameters of the model. The computer tunes the parameters. Humans tune the hyperparameters to make sure that the training looks good on the loss graph. I'm going to design those, decisions. And those the three key hyperparameters that we care about is the learning rate, the batch size, and number of iterations or number of epochs, depending on which one you're going to select. And then for training, for like you get a task, how do you actually use a computer vision model on it? Well, you're going to have to look at how many images do you have available to train, if any, and do you need to improve on what's already there? Then you're going to choose between sort of these four options, is which your options are. All right, that's everything. We are over time. Are there any questions about that? I think I'll answer questions first. Yeah. Any questions about what we talked about here?
Hi, Brandon.
Hi, Lasantha. What's up?
I have a questions about the validation set.
Okay, the validation set.
How
Yes.
to define the validation set? It is a testing set or
It is more akin to a training set than it is to a testing set.
it's a training set, but it's a free training set
So
or
what you'd usually do is you'd take your training set and then you'll actually cut it up into like 80% what you're actually going to tune the parameters on, and then 20% what you're going to tune the hyperparameters on.
so so validation set is also already defined before we doing this testing, right?
Often it's not. Often you define it. Often you'll like randomly create it. So in public data sets, if you like compete on public leaderboards on public data set benchmark data sets, they'll have the training set and the test set defined, and often they won't even let you see the testing set. They won't even let you see the testing set labels, for example. They'll just say, here are some images, you need to make predictions, and then we'll tell you whether you're right or wrong. Because they really don't want people to be testing, they don't want to be tuning anything at all on the testing set. They just give you a training set. And so when you're tuning your hyperparameters, usually you go, well, I don't want to be tuning the hyperparameters on the training set, the same ones that the model is finding the parameters for. So I'll split up the training set into like the part that's actually the training for the model in the main loop, and then the part that's the validation set, which is what we use to select the hyperparameters.
Okay. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. There's no more questions. I'm going to spend just a few minutes more going back and filling in a little more detail out of this part that I went through really fast. In particular, the architecture. I want to talk about this a little more in just for a couple of minutes. So we said that the architecture is the arrangement of layers and their sizes. And what you'll actually find is that there's some common architectures that turn out to work pretty well across different tasks. Not even the weights in those architectures, just like the arrangement of layers and their sizes, and then training the weights separately on them all the time. And for a convolutional neural network, usually it consists of a bunch of convolutional layers, and then at the end, often, not always, but often, there'll be a couple of fully connected layers to finish it off. And so these convolution layers, those convolution layers are the layers that learn search patterns. And then the fully connected layer is the thing that pulls it together to make your final prediction. Okay, looking across the whole image, where is it found a dog? It's found a dog part in the dog head in the top left. Let's look at this image. It's found a dog head in the very middle. It's found a dog body in the middle bottom. And then combining that together into a single thing is the job of the fully connected layers. And so you have a convolutional neural network that has convolutional layers and then fully connected layers. And the exact number of convolutional layers and how they're connected is the architecture. And there's a couple of common architectures that sort of appeared early in this process, in like discovering this. Like researchers found that they work pretty well, and they've sort of become de facto standard. So in the lab, you'll find the ResNet architecture is a very common architecture. It's been used since it was created in 2015, up until it was even used in image generator models up until like last year, and still is used in image generator models, but it tends to be newer architectures more commonly now. But that ResNet model has been in use by a bunch, and the ResNet model is just the exact arrangement of layers and how big they are, essentially. All right. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about here. All right, cool. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for that. Sorry, that slide was wrong. That's it, and I will see everyone who's coming to the lab in the lab session, which I'll begin in a couple of minutes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.